Imagine yourself at a lavish ballroom, surrounded by opulence and high society, the air thick with secrets. On one hand, the world's most famous detective, Hercule Poirot, with his egg-shaped head and meticulous mannerisms, is about to embark on a case that will send shockwaves through London's elite. It all began on a bright spring morning, with Poirot in his cozy London rooms, applying a dab of pomade to his perfectly styled mustache, his usual charming vanity. I, his loyal companion, was deep in thought, trying to unravel the knot of questions surrounding the bizarre events at the Victory Ball. What happened that fateful night? Who killed Lord Cronshaw, the young and wealthy Viscount? Was the mysterious death of Coco Corton, the famous actress, truly an accident, or was something darker at play? The more I read, the more tangled the mystery seemed, until Poirot's voice broke through my musings. He wasn't looking at the case. He was admiring his new pomade. "Mon ami," he said, "the pomade is a marvel for the mustache, but these questions you have, they deserve answers." Before I could respond, the door to our flat opened. It was Inspector Japp from Scotland Yard, an old friend who always seemed to find us at just the right moment. "I've got a case that's right up your alley, Poirot," Japp said, with a twinkle in his eye. "The Victory Ball. It's got your name all over it." Poirot, always the one to dive into the heart of any mystery, looked at me with a mischievous smile. "Ah, my friend Hastings would be eager to get involved, too," he said, inviting the inspector in. And so, what started as a quiet morning quickly transformed into an investigation that would unravel one of the most sensational mysteries of the season, full of glittering high society, dark secrets, and Poirot's brilliant mind at work. Now, are you ready to uncover the truth with us? Let's begin. It was a grand evening of masks, mystery, and indulgence, the Victory Ball. London's elite gathered at the magnificent Colossus Hall, draped in their finest costumes. Among them, Lord Cronshaw's party stood out, representing the old Italian comedy. "Ah, the commedia dell'arte," Poirot murmured, tilting his head thoughtfully. "Whatever that means," Inspector Japp replied with a shrug. Anyway, their costumes were modeled after some china figures from Lord Cronshaw's uncle's collection. Japp paused, recounting the lineup with a flair of drama. Lord Cronshaw himself was Harlequin. His uncle, the Honorable Eustace Beltane, came as Punchinello. The vivacious widow Mrs. Malaby matched him as Pantaloon. Then there were the Davidsons, dressed as Pierrot and Pierrette. And of course the belle of the ball, Miss Coco Courtney, dazzling as Columbine. Poirot's eyebrows lifted slightly. A colorful group indeed, and yet something was amiss. "Right you are," Japp agreed, leaning forward. "Cronshaw was moody from the start. You know the type, brooding, distant. And when the party met for supper in a private room, the tension was so thick you could cut it with a knife. Miss Courtney had clearly been crying, her eyes red, her demeanor hysterical. The two weren't speaking. Everyone noticed. Poirot's lips curved into a knowing smile. "Ah, love's quarrels. They have a way of unraveling the most glittering occasions." Japp nodded. Well, the meal was a disaster. Miss Courtney finally turned to young Chris Davidson, the actor, and said loud enough for everyone to hear, "Take me home. I'm sick of this ball." Hastings, ever the dramatic one, interjected. The poor girl must have been beside herself. What happened next? Japp smirked. Davidson hesitated, mind you, glancing nervously at Cronshaw. But in the end he gave in, took her back to her flat while she sobbed the whole way. She wouldn't say much, just kept muttering, "I'll make him sorry for this." Repeated it like a mantra. Strange, that. Poirot's fingers tapped rhythmically on the table. A promise or a threat? Exactly, Japp exclaimed, snapping his fingers. But here's the thing. Davidson didn't return to the ball. By the time he calmed her down, it was too late. So he went home. Meanwhile, back at the Colossus Hall, things took a dark turn. Hastings leaned forward, captivated. What happened? Japp's tone grew grave. Lord Cronshaw grew even more withdrawn. He avoided his party, barely seen for the rest of the evening. Around 1:30 a.m., just before the grand unmasking, Captain Digby, an old army friend, spotted him standing in a box, gazing down at the crowd. "Hello, Cronch," Digby called out. "Come down and join the fun. What are you moping about up there like a boiled owl?" Cronshaw turned, gave a tight smile, and replied, "Wait for me. I'll be right down." Then he disappeared. Poirot's eyes gleamed. And he never returned. "Exactly," Japp said grimly. Digby and Mrs. Davidson waited, but Cronshaw didn't show. Impatient, they decided to go look for him. Mrs. Malaby joined them, all bubbly and confident. "Oh, he's being a grump tonight," she said. "Let's drag him out, shall we?" The search was on. They combed the hall with no luck, until Mrs. Malaby suggested checking the supper room. And there he was, but not as they'd hoped. Japp paused for effect, letting the weight of his words settle. In the supper room, they found Lord Cronshaw, still dressed as Harlequin, lying on the floor, with a table knife plunged into his heart. Hastings gasped audibly. "Good heavens!" Poirot, ever calm, tilted his head. "An affair indeed, and no clue left behind, you say?" "None," Japp replied. "Just the chilling sight of a man cut down in his prime, but that's not all." Poirot leaned in, intrigued. "There's more?" Japp nodded, his voice low. The next morning, the papers were ablaze with headlines about the tragedy, but buried among them was another shocking revelation. Miss Coco Courtney was found dead in her flat, an apparent overdose of cocaine. A coincidence, or something more sinister? Poirot's eyes narrowed. 2 deaths, 1 ball, and a tangled web of secrets. "Exactly," Japp said. "That's why I'm here. What do you say, Poirot? Fancy untangling this one?" Poirot smiled, his mustache twitching slightly. "Ah, mon ami, how can I resist such a challenge? Let us begin." The next day, scandal spread like wildfire across London. Headlines screamed the tragedy. Miss Coco Courtney found dead. The popular actress, a darling of the stage, was discovered lifeless in her bed, a victim of a cocaine overdose. Was it an accident or suicide? Japp wondered aloud, shaking his head. Poirot raised an eyebrow. "And what says the maid?" "Admitted as much," Japp replied, frowning. Apparently, Coco was a regular user, a confirmed taker, as the girl put it. Coroner ruled it an accident, but... He paused, his face darkening. "You can't ignore the possibility of suicide. Her death, Poirot, it leaves us without a single clue about the quarrel she had with Cronshaw the night before." Poirot steepled his fingers, his expression sharp. "A quarrel can be as deadly as a knife, mon ami, and what of this? A detail, perhaps." Japp nodded. "Now, here's the odd bit. A small enamel box was found on Cronshaw's body, decorated with cocoa in diamonds, half full of cocaine. The maid swore it belonged to her mistress. Coco always had it on her stash, you see. But why was it on him? Especially since Cronshaw despised drugs, hated them, in fact." Poirot's mustache twitched. "So he knew of her addiction, and yet he carried her box. Intriguing, is it not?" Japp shrugged. "I'd say it's damning, if we had any proof he used it, but Cronshaw, a drug addict, never." Poirot leaned forward, his eyes glittering. "And yet, Inspector, possession speaks loudly, does it not? But you have more, I think." Japp reached into his pocket, producing a small object. He placed it in Poirot's palm with care. This was found in Cronshaw's hand, clenched tight, a green silk pom-pom, torn and frayed at the edges. What do you make of that? Poirot studied it intently before handing it back. His lips curved into the faintest of smiles. A trinket from the drama, no doubt. But let us continue. Tell me, did Lord Cronshaw have enemies? None that we know of, Japp replied, scratching his chin. Popular chap, well liked. But if you ask who benefits, it's his uncle, Eustace Beltane. The title and estates pass to him now. Suspicious, Poirot mused. And was Beltane present at this fateful ball? Japp nodded grimly. He was Punchinello, remember? And there's talk. Several witnesses heard a row in the supper room. Heated voices. One of them was Beltane's. And his excuse? Says he was scolding a drunken waiter. Claims it happened earlier, before 1 o'clock, but... Japp trailed off, his expression troubled. Poirot gestured for him to continue. Well, Japp admitted reluctantly, it doesn't fit. Cronshaw was seen alive at 1:30, and he was found dead just minutes later. 10 minutes at most. Time enough to quarrel, Poirot murmured. And his costume. A hump and ruffle, no? Yes, but I don't see how. Poirot cut him off with a knowing smile. Ah, but there was a curtain in the supper room, n'est-ce pas, with a recess behind it, enough to conceal a man. Japp blinked. How did you? Poirot waved a hand dismissively. I supplied the curtain from my imagination, mon cher. Without it, the drama lacks sense. And yet, this doctor, what of him? Did he remark upon the state of the body? Japp hesitated. Well, he did mention something odd. Stiffness in the limbs. Unusual tension. Said he couldn't explain it. Aha! Poirot exclaimed, leaning back triumphantly. That gives one to think, does it not? Poison? Japp scoffed. Come now, Poirot. Who'd poison a man and stab him with a knife? That's just ridiculous. Poirot chuckled softly, his tone placid. Ridiculous? Perhaps. But mon ami, murder is rarely simple, and when passion, drugs, and inheritance collide, there is much to untangle. Shall we continue, Inspector? We set off immediately for Berkeley Square in a taxi. Upon arriving, we learned the new Lord Cronshaw was not at home. However, at Japp's insistence, we were ushered into the china room, where the prized collection of figurines was kept. Japp glanced around helplessly. I don't see how you'll ever find the ones you're after, Poirot. But Poirot had already sprung into action, dragging a chair in front of the mantelpiece. Like a nimble bird, he hopped onto it, his eyes gleaming with purpose. Above the mirror, on a narrow shelf to themselves, stood 6 exquisite china figures. Poirot examined them with the care of a jeweler appraising a rare gem. Ah, he murmured, the old Italian comedy, La Commedia dell'arte. 6 pairs. Harlequin and Columbine, Pierrot and Pierrette, delicate in white and green. And finally, Punchinello and Pulcinella, elaborate in mauve and yellow. Look at Punchinello's costume. Ruffles, frills, a hump, a high hat. Yes, just as I thought, very elaborate. He replaced the figures carefully, hopping down from the chair. His expression was unreadable, but it was clear he'd pieced together something important. Japp, however, was less convinced. Well, I don't see what that tells us, Japp muttered, scratching his head. Poirot only smiled. Patience, mon ami. All will become clear. As we prepared to leave, the new Lord Cronshaw entered. The man, now the 6th Viscount Cronshaw, was in his early 50s with a suave demeanor and a dissolute face. His languid manner, coupled with an air of superiority, rubbed me the wrong way instantly. "I've heard much about your skills, Monsieur Poirot," he drawled, his voice as smooth as velvet, but lacking warmth. "The police are doing their best, but I fear the mystery of my nephew's death will never be solved. It's also utterly baffling." Poirot watched him keenly. "Your nephew had no enemies that you know of." "None whatsoever," Lord Cronshaw replied smoothly. "He was well liked, I'm certain of that." Poirot tilted his head. "And the costumes for the ball, they were copied exactly from your china figures, down to the smallest detail?" "Of course," Cronshaw said with a thin smile. "Merci, milord. That is all I wish to confirm. Good day." As we left, Japp shot Poirot a look. "What now?" he asked. Poirot's eyes sparkled mischievously. "The case, mon ami, it is complete." Japp's jaw dropped. "Complete? You mean you know who killed Lord Cronshaw?" "Mais oui." Poirot's voice was maddeningly calm. "Well, who was it?" Poirot's lips twitched. "Eustace Belane." "What?" Japp exclaimed. "How can you be sure? Spill it, Poirot." "Ah, my friend, you know my little weakness," Poirot said with a sly smile. "I must keep the threads of the case in my own hands until the very last moment. But fear not, you shall have all the glory. I ask only that you allow me to orchestrate the denouement." Japp sighed, shaking his head. "Fine, Poirot, but I'll believe it when I see it. You're a cagey one, aren't you?" Poirot merely chuckled, his mustache twitching with amusement. As Japp strode off to Scotland Yard, Poirot hailed a taxi. "Where now?" I asked, unable to contain my curiosity. "To Chelsea," Poirot replied. "We must visit the Davidsons." He gave the driver the address, then turned to me with a sly look. "What do you think of the new Lord Cronshaw?" he asked. I frowned. "I don't trust him. Something about him feels wrong." Poirot nodded thoughtfully. "The wicked uncle of the storybooks, perhaps." "Exactly." "Perhaps," Poirot said noncommittally, "though he was most gracious to us. Was he not?" "Because he has his reasons," I shot back. Poirot sighed, shaking his head. "Ah, Hastings. Always the heart, never the method." The Davidsons lived on the third floor of a quaint Chelsea building. As we climbed the stairs, I couldn't help but wonder what new revelations awaited us. The Davidsons lived on the third floor of a block of mansion flats. The building had the faint air of faded grandeur, its corridors lined with peeling wallpaper and dim lighting that hinted at better days. A maid showed us into a long, low room adorned with garish oriental hangings. The air was stiflingly close, heavy with the cloying scent of joss sticks that seemed to crawl into every corner. It was a room designed to impress, but succeeded only in unsettling. Mrs. Davidson appeared shortly, a small, fair woman with delicate features that might have evoked sympathy, if not for the calculating glint in her pale blue eyes. She carried herself with a fragility that seemed as much artifice as truth. "Poor Cronch, and poor Coco, too," she sighed, clasping her hands together. "We were both so fond of her. Her death has been such a terrible grief to us." Poirot inclined his head politely. "Madame, believe me, I wish not to trouble you unnecessarily. Inspector Japp has already relayed the key details of that evening. However, there is one small matter, a detail, perhaps, that I must verify for myself." Mrs. Davidson looked wary but intrigued. "And what is that?" "The costume you wore at the ball that night." Her brows lifted in mild surprise. "The costume?" "Oui, madame," Poirot said, his voice soothing as a lullaby. "In my country, it is customary to reconstruct every element of a crime. Even the smallest detail may prove illuminating. Your costume may seem trivial, but I assure you it is not." Still looking puzzled, Mrs. Davidson nodded. "I've heard of reconstruction, of course, but I didn't realize it extended to costumes. Very well, I'll fetch it. She left the room, her footsteps light but purposeful. As we waited, I leaned toward Poirot. What do you expect to find? Patience, Hastings, he murmured, eyes closed as if already arranging the puzzle pieces in his mind. Moments later, Mrs. Davidson returned, carrying a dainty wisp of white satin and green. She handed it to Poirot, who accepted it with the reverence of a museum curator handling a priceless relic. He examined it carefully, his fingers brushing over the fabric. Finally, he returned it to her with a small bow. Merci, madame. I see you have had the misfortune to lose one of the green pompons from the shoulder. Here, no. Mrs. Davidson hesitated for just a fraction of a second. Yes, she said, a little too quickly. It got torn off during the ball. I remember picking it up and giving it to poor Lord Cronshaw to keep for me. And this was after supper? Poirot's tone was as light as a feather, but his eyes were razor-sharp. Oh, no, she said hastily, her pale eyes widening slightly. Not long after supper, actually. Quite soon after. Ah, I see, Poirot replied, nodding thoughtfully. That is all, madame. I shall trouble you no further. Bonjour. As we left the building, I turned to him, my curiosity piqued. Well, that clears up the mystery of the green pompon, doesn't it? Poirot's mustache twitched with amusement. Does it, Hastings? Of course, I said confidently. She gave it to Lord Cronshaw, just as she said. Poirot stopped abruptly, turning to face me with an expression of mock exasperation. Mon ami, you saw me examine the dress, did you not? Yes. And did you not notice that the pompon had not been torn off, as Madame claimed, but rather cut off? I stared at him, dumbfounded. Cut off? With scissors? Precisely. The threads were clean and even. There was no sign of a tear. Dear me, I muttered, feeling the ground of my understanding shift beneath me. This becomes more and more complicated. Non, Poirot said with maddening calm. It becomes more and more simple. Poirot, I cried, throwing up my hands. One day I shall murder you. Your habit of finding everything perfectly simple is infuriating. Ah, Hastings, Poirot said with a fond smile. And yet, is it not true that when I explain, you see that it is simple? Yes, I admitted begrudgingly. That's the aggravating part. You make me feel as though I could have solved it myself if only I'd thought of it first. And so you could, mon ami, Poirot said warmly, if only you would learn to arrange your ideas with method. Without method, Hastings, you are like a— Yes, I interrupted hastily, for I could sense a lecture brewing. Tell me, what do we do next? Are you really going to reconstruct the crime? Poirot chuckled. Hardly, but we are getting close, mon cher Hastings, very close indeed. The following Tuesday was set for Poirot's grand reveal. His plans remained shrouded in secrecy, though the preparations intrigued me to no end. A large white screen was erected at one end of the room, flanked by heavy curtains. A man with lighting equipment arrived and busied himself, tinkering with switches and beams. Then came a troupe of theatrical professionals, each slipping discreetly into Poirot's makeshift dressing room. A transformed bedroom that now served as a hive of whispered instructions and hurried costume changes. By the time Japp arrived, the atmosphere was crackling with anticipation. His mood, however, was less enthusiastic. Bit melodramatic, this, he muttered, loosening his collar. Typical Poirot. Always got to make a song and dance about things. Still, can't deny the man's clever. Might save us a headache or two if his hunch is right. I bit back a smile. Japp's grumbles often carried an undertone of reluctant admiration. The guests began to arrive. Lord Cronshaw, looking every bit the debonair aristocrat, escorted Mrs. Mallaby, a dark-haired beauty with an air of nervousness that her painted smile couldn't quite conceal. The Davidsons followed. Christine Davidson, tall and striking, walked with the confident grace of a seasoned actress, while her husband exuded a more rugged charm, his features set in a mask of curious detachment. Poirot had arranged seats facing the screen, and as everyone settled in, the lights dimmed until only the screen remained illuminated. In the shadowy gloom, Poirot's voice rang out, commanding and theatrical. Mesdames et messieurs, a word of explanation. You will see 6 figures pass across the screen. They are characters you know well: Pio and his Pierrette, Punchinello the buffoon, elegant Pulcinella, beautiful Columbine, and Harley Quinn, the sprite invisible to man. Observe carefully. The room fell silent, a charged stillness settling over the gathering. The performance began. One by one, the figures emerged, their silhouettes sharp and haunting against the white screen. Pio with his Pierrette, Punchinello with his elaborate frills, Pulcinella, Columbine, and finally Harley Quinn, leaping and twisting with an otherworldly grace. Each figure lingered only a moment before vanishing behind the curtain. When the final shadow faded, the lights came up. A collective sigh rippled through the room, a mixture of relief and confusion. For my part, I was thoroughly perplexed. If Poirot had hoped to unmask the culprit through this shadowy charade, it seemed an abject failure. No one screamed, fainted, or bolted for the door. The criminal, if present, remained frustratingly composed. Poirot, however, appeared utterly unfazed. He stepped forward, his face radiant with satisfaction. "Now, mesdames et messieurs," he began, "I ask you for your impressions. One at a time, if you please. Milord Cronshaw, may we start with you?" Cronshaw hesitated, clearly baffled. "I'm afraid I don't quite follow. What do you want to know?" "Simple, milord. What have you just seen?" "Well?" Cronshaw fumbled, rubbing his chin. "We saw 6 figures, dressed as characters from the old Italian comedy." "Perfect." Poirot's approval was almost gleeful. "And you, madame?" He turned to Mrs. Mallaby. "Yes," she stammered. 6 figures, the Italian comedy, of course." Poirot nodded. "Monsieur Davidson?" "Same here," Davidson said briskly. 6 figures, comedy of Italy, that's what it looked like." "Madame Davidson?" "Yes," she replied, a hint of impatience in her tone. "Exactly as they've all said." Finally, Poirot turned to me. "Hastings?" I cleared my throat. "Yes, 6 figures representing the Italian comedy." Poirot clasped his hands together, his eyes twinkling with mischief. "Ah, bon. Then, mes amis, we all agree on what we saw. But perhaps—" He paused, drawing out the tension with deliberate precision. "Perhaps not on what it means." The room stiffened. Even Jap, seated in the corner with arms crossed, leaned forward slightly. Poirot's voice dropped, low and resonant. "Now, my friends, let us peel away the mask." Poirot turned to face us, his usually composed expression now shadowed with something fierce. His eyes gleamed, unnervingly cat-like, a piercing green that seemed to strip away the very fabric of our reality. "And yet," he began, his voice sharp and cutting, "you are all wrong. Your eyes have lied to you, as they lied to you on the night of the Victory Ball. To see with the eyes, as they say, is not always to see the truth. No. To see the truth, one must use the eyes of the mind. One must engage the little gray cells." His declaration hung in the air, dense and electric. "Know this, mes amis. Tonight, and on the night of the Victory Ball, you saw not 6 figures but 5. The room collectively froze. A breathless silence followed, thick with confusion and disbelief. Before anyone could respond, the lights went out again. A figure leaped in front of the screen, illuminated against the white backdrop, Poirot. The flowing costume of white and green shimmered faintly under the spotlight. Poirot's voice rang out, a challenge in every word. "Who is that?" "Poirot," we cried in unison. "Regardez encore, look again." With a dramatic flourish, the figure grasped the loose Poirot costume and, with a single movement, tore it away. The flowing folds of fabric dropped to the floor. Beneath, in all his glittering splendor, stood Harlequin. The crowd gasped. Before the shock could settle, chaos erupted. From the shadows, a chair toppled over with a crash. A strangled cry pierced the air. "Curse you!" The voice was raw with fury and desperation. "Curse you, Poirot! How did you guess?" Christopher Davidson stepped forward, his face a contorted mask of rage. His movements were wild, but he was swiftly subdued. The unmistakable clink of handcuffs followed as Japp advanced, his expression grim yet resolute. "Christopher Davidson," Japp declared with practiced authority, "I arrest you on the charge of murdering Viscount Cronshaw. Anything you say will be used as evidence against you." Davidson's shoulders sagged, the fight draining out of him. As Japp led him away, the room erupted in whispered speculations and gasps of astonishment. The atmosphere in Poirot's flat was a stark contrast to the earlier tension. A lavish little supper had appeared, the scent of rich pâté and freshly baked bread filling the air. Poirot, positively radiant, flitted about the room, pouring glasses of wine and accepting our congratulations with modest pride. "Ah, my friends," he said, settling into a chair with an air of satisfaction. "You see now how it was done, do you not?" "Not entirely," I admitted. "You must explain everything, Poirot. From the beginning, if you please." "Mais oui," he exclaimed, rubbing his hands together. It was, as always, a matter of method. The green pom-pom was the key. It was found in the dead man's hand, suggesting that it had been torn from the costume of his attacker during the struggle. From that detail alone, I knew Pierrette could be ruled out. A delicate creature such as she could not possibly summon the strength to drive a knife deep into a man's chest. He paused, his eyes twinkling with mischief. That left Poirot as the logical suspect. However, Poirot, Monsieur Davidson, had supposedly left the ball 2 hours before the murder. For him to be guilty, one of two things must be true. Either he returned later to commit the crime, or, voila, he killed Lord Cronshaw before he left. "But how could that be?" I interjected. "Lord Cronshaw was seen alive after Davidson left." "Precisely, mon cher Hastings. Or so it appeared. Only Mrs. Davidson claimed to have seen him alive after supper, and that, I suspected, was a lie. A lie designed to provide an alibi for her husband and to account for the missing pom-pom." "Her husband?" I echoed, startled. "Yes, Hastings. Christopher Davidson donned the Poirot costume and attacked Lord Cronshaw shortly after supper. The murder was swift and silent. He then changed into the Harlequin costume, blending seamlessly with the other guests, and departed the scene under a different guise." "But why would he do such a thing?" Mrs. Mallaby asked, her voice trembling. Poirot leaned forward, his expression grave. "The motive, madame, was blackmail. Lord Cronshaw had discovered Davidson's secret, a scandalous affair that would ruin his career and reputation. Davidson saw no other way out." "And the performance tonight?" Japp asked, shaking his head. Poirot's face broke into a triumphant smile. "Ah, Inspector, I simply recreated the deception. When Davidson recognized himself in the Harlequin's glittering guise, he knew the game was up. His guilt betrayed itself." The room fell silent, everyone absorbing the brilliance of Poirot's deductions. Then, slowly, applause began to ripple through the gathering. Poirot inclined his head graciously. "Merci, mes amis. Justice has been served, and the little gray cells have triumphed once more." Poirot leaned forward, his sharp gaze locking onto each of us in turn, his voice steady and measured as he unraveled the intricacies of the case. "Let us begin," he said, "with the missing green pom-pom. You see, mes amis, it was never truly missing. It was merely replaced." Mrs. Davidson, in her desperation to shield her husband, cleverly cut a pom-pom from her own Pierrette costume to replace the one that had gone astray on her husband's Poirot costume. Ingenious, non. Yet such deception cannot fool the little gray cells. He paused, savoring the moment before continuing. But there was something more. Harley Quinn, who was seen in the box at precisely 1:30 a.m., must have been an impersonation. The truth became obvious when I considered the logistics. Could someone like Mr. Belaine, encumbered by his elaborate Punchinello costume, have also posed as Harley Quinn? Such a feat would have been impossible. But to Christopher Davidson, an actor by profession and a man of similar height and build to the victim, the transformation was child's play. Poirot's voice dropped to a conspiratorial whisper, his eyes glinting. But there was one detail that troubled even me. How, I asked myself, could a doctor fail to notice the difference between a man who had been dead for 2 hours and one who had been dead for a mere 10 minutes? It seemed inconceivable. Then, mes amis, I realized the answer. The doctor was not asked to deduce when the victim had died. Instead, he was told that the man had been seen alive only 10 minutes earlier. Naturally, he accepted this as fact and was perplexed only by the abnormal stiffening of the limbs, which he commented upon at the inquest. He did not realize that he was observing rigor mortis already setting in. A collective murmur rippled through the room as the pieces of the puzzle began to align. Poirot raised a hand to silence us, his voice gaining strength. With this, the sequence of events fell into place. Davidson lured Lord Cronshaw back into the supper room under the pretense of a private conversation. There, he struck. The attack was swift and deliberate, leaving the victim no chance to cry out. The green pom-pom was torn off in the struggle, clutched in Lord Cronshaw's dying grip. Then Davidson left the ball, escorting Miss Courtenay as planned. He dropped her at her flat but did not stay, as he had claimed. Instead, he hurried back to the Colossus Theater, but not as Poirot. No, mes amis, he returned as Harley Quinn. The transformation was remarkably simple. He merely shed his outer costume, leaving him clad in the glittering guise of the mischievous Harlequin. In this new identity he blended seamlessly back into the party, ensuring no one would suspect him of foul play. Poirot stood, his presence commanding as he delivered the final blow. By the time Lord Cronshaw's body was discovered, Davidson was long gone, his alibi seemingly unshakable. Yet the green pom-pom, the doctor's observations, and the theatrics of the costumes all betrayed him. He had underestimated one thing, that I, Hercule Poirot, would see through the layers of deception. The room was utterly still, every word of Poirot's explanation landing like a hammer-stroke. The dead man's uncle, Lord Cronshaw's closest kin, leaned back in his chair, his face pale but composed. "It is a remarkable tale, Monsieur Poirot," he said at last. "I must commend your genius. But tell me, was Davidson's motive purely to silence my nephew, or was there more to it?" Poirot inclined his head gravely. The motive, Monseigneur, is always the most human part of the crime. Lord Cronshaw had uncovered a terrible secret, a scandal that would have destroyed Davidson's career and reputation. He sought to blackmail Davidson, believing he could control the actor's future. But Davidson, consumed by pride and desperation, saw no way out but murder. A shudder ran through the assembled guests, the weight of Poirot's words settling heavily upon them. "And Mrs. Davidson?" I asked, unable to suppress my curiosity. "Did she know?" "Indeed, she knew," Poirot replied. "Her actions to protect her husband, the replacement of the pom-pom, the false testimony, were acts of loyalty. Misguided, yes, but loyalty nonetheless. She believed she was aiding an innocent man." Japp, who had been quietly listening, finally spoke. "Well, Poirot, you've done it again. A clean arrest, a solid case. The courts will take it from here." Poirot's expression softened, and he gestured to the little supper that awaited us. "Ah, mon ami, let us leave the law to its duty. For now, let us celebrate the triumph of truth and the power of the little gray cells." As we gathered around the table, the tension of the evening gave way to an atmosphere of camaraderie. Poirot's brilliance had once again brought light to the shadows, and we raised our glasses in his honor. "To Poirot," we toasted. He smiled, a twinkle in his eye. "Non, mes amis, to justice, shadows among the Persian tiles." It was 6 o'clock in the morning when Mr. Parker Pyne, famed solver of human dilemmas, embarked on yet another adventure. This time, exploring the mysteries of Persia. After a brief stop in Baghdad, the little monoplane was ready to carry him further into the heart of the ancient land. But the cramped confines of the aircraft left much to be desired for the robust Mr. Parker Pyne, whose comfort was thoroughly compromised by the narrow seats. Joining him on this journey were two peculiar companions, a large, florid man who seemed the very embodiment of idle chatter, and a thin, sharp-faced woman with pursed lips and an air of unyielding determination. As Mr. Parker Pyne sized them up, he thought, with no small relief, "At least they don't look like the type to seek my professional advice." Indeed, they did not. The woman, it turned out, was an American missionary, her life a testament to hard work and unshakable happiness. The man, on the other hand, was an employee of an oil company, his tales flowing freely as they waited for the plane to take off. Mr. Parker Pyne introduced himself modestly, declaring, "I am merely a tourist, I'm afraid." He added, with a touch of delight, "I'm visiting Tehran, Isfahan, and Shiraz." The sheer lyrical beauty of the names enchanted him so much that he repeated them aloud, savoring each syllable. "Tehran, Isfahan, Shiraz," he murmured, lost in the music of the words. As the plane soared over the flat desert below, Mr. Parker Pyne felt a sense of awe. The vast, uninhabited expanse whispered of ancient mysteries and untold stories. At Kermanshah, the plane descended for passport examinations and customs inspections. A small cardboard box in Mr. Parker Pyne's luggage drew undue attention, leading to a flurry of questions in Persian. Unfortunately, Mr. Parker Pyne's knowledge of the language was non-existent. Enter the pilot, a fair-haired young German with piercing blue eyes and a face weathered by years of flying. He approached with an easy smile, asking, "Please, may I help?" "It's bug powder," Mr. Parker Pyne explained, his tone exasperated yet hopeful. "Could you possibly convey that to them?" The pilot grinned, translating the words into Persian. The solemn officials' faces brightened, their laughter breaking the tension. Relieved, Mr. Parker Pyne resumed his seat as the flight continued. At Hamadan, the plane briefly swooped low to deliver mail, but did not stop. Mr. Parker Pyne strained to catch a glimpse of the famous Rock of Behistun, where the ancient Persian king Darius had immortalized his conquests in 3 languages. By the time the plane reached Tehran at 1 p.m., Mr. Parker Pyne was more than ready for a change of scenery. However, Tehran proved a disappointment. To Mr. Parker Pine's dismay, the city was distressingly modern, lacking the charm and mystique he had anticipated. That evening, as he entered his hotel, he spotted the German pilot and, on an impulse, invited him to dinner. Over a meal that concluded with sticky chocolate confections and thick cups of sweet coffee, the two men conversed. "You go to Shiraz next?" asked the pilot. "Yes," replied Mr. Parker Pine. "I plan to fly there, then return by road through Isfahan and Tehran." The pilot shook his head. "Not me. I return to Baghdad tomorrow, but you must be careful. Shiraz is a place of beauty and secrets." As they talked, the pilot grew reflective. "Do you know," he said, "my first passengers were two English ladies. One of them was very young, very well born, Lady Esther Carr. A minister's daughter, they said. She was beautiful, but—" He hesitated. "But what?" prompted Mr. Parker Pine. "Mad," the pilot declared bluntly. "Completely mad. She lives in Shiraz now, in a great house surrounded by lush gardens. They say she wears Eastern dress and refuses to see Europeans. A strange life for a lady of her upbringing, wouldn't you agree?" Intrigued, Mr. Parker Pine felt a familiar stir of curiosity. Who was Lady Esther Carr? Why had she abandoned her English roots for the mysterious allure of Shiraz? What secrets lay hidden within the walls of her house? As the pilot bid him good night, Mr. Parker Pine knew one thing for certain. Shiraz held more than the promise of beauty. It held a mystery, one that he, Parker Pine, could not resist unraveling. And so, with anticipation coursing through him, he prepared for the next leg of his journey, unaware of the shadows awaiting him in the heart of Persia. Imagine standing at the edge of a mystery, where the air is thick with secrets, and every word drips with intrigue. Mr. Parker Pine was about to step into just such a story. It all began with a chance conversation. A pilot with piercing blue eyes and a rugged charm recounting a tale of two Englishwomen in Shiraz. One of them, Lady Esther Carr, had descended into madness, abandoning her life for an isolated existence in a house draped in vibrant blue, rose and yellow tiles. The other woman? Dead under suspicious circumstances. She was a flower, the pilot had whispered, his voice tinged with melancholy. But the other one, mad, completely mad, maybe she killed her. Those words lingered, haunting Mr. Parker Pine as he gazed upon Shiraz from the skies, a lush emerald oasis cradled by barren, unforgiving mountains. The city was alive with the colors and chaos of the Nowruz festival, the Persian New Year. But Parker Pine's mind was already elsewhere. He had seen the house. Nestled in a green garden bursting with orange trees, roses, and sparkling water, it called to him. It wasn't just a house. It was a dream, trapped in stone and tile. A place too beautiful to hold darkness. Yet the whispers of tragedy made it impossible to see it as anything but sinister. That evening, over dinner with the English consul, Parker Pine leaned in. "What's the story with that house?" The consul chuckled. "Ah, the house at Shiraz. Fascinating, isn't it? Built by a governor who lined his pockets well. His legacy, you could say. But now it belongs to Lady Esther Carr." "And?" Parker Pine prodded. "She's mad as a hatter. 30 years old, but you'd think she's ancient the way she's buried herself in that house. Won't see anyone British. Dresses like the locals. Lives like them, too." "And the other Englishwoman?" Parker Pine's voice lowered, cutting through the consul's rambling. The consul hesitated. "Died about 3 years ago. Fell from a balcony while carrying a breakfast tray. Cracked her skull on the stone below. Tragic, but accidents happen." Parker Pine's mind raced. A young, vibrant woman leaving her world behind. Another woman dead in a supposedly accidental fall. A pilot's wistful memories tinged with suspicion. This wasn't just a story. It was an enigma wrapped in shadow, and Parker Pine couldn't resist unraveling it. That night, as the stars lit the Persian sky, Mr. Parker Pine made a decision. He would uncover the truth behind the house at Shiraz. Because, as he well knew, in every whispered tale of madness and tragedy, there was always more than met the eye. This wasn't just a house. It was the heart of a story waiting to be told, and Parker Pine was ready to step inside. In the fading glow of dusk, the gardens of the house at Shiraz seemed to hold their breath. Mr. Parker Pine, ever the observer of human nature, found himself walking through this enigmatic paradise. The scent of orange blossoms mingled with the faint chill of the evening air, as a Persian servant led him up an outside staircase to the back of the house. The door creaked open, revealing a courtyard bathed in moonlight. At the center of it all reclined a figure that could only be described as regal. Lady Esther Carr, draped in flowing Eastern robes that accentuated her striking, almost otherworldly beauty, sat on a grand divan. Her posture was commanding, her chin tilted upward, her dark eyes glinting with a mixture of arrogance and curiosity. "Ah, Mr. Parker Pine," she said, her voice low and velvety, though carrying a tone that suggested she was accustomed to being obeyed. "Sit there." Her slender hand gestured toward a pile of cushions on the floor. On her finger, an enormous emerald ring glinted in the lamplight, carved with the crest of her family, a piece of history and wealth, worn with the confidence of someone who understood its value. Parker Pine, a man of practical build and less than practical knees, lowered himself onto the cushions with as much dignity as he could muster. He accepted a cup of coffee from the silent servant, sipping it slowly, savoring the rich aroma. Lady Esther, too, held her coffee, her eyes half closed, giving the impression of infinite leisure. For a moment, they sat in silence. The atmosphere was thick with unspoken tension, like a chessboard before the first move. Finally, she spoke, her tone clipped, almost accusatory. "So, you help unhappy people," she said, her lips curling slightly in disdain. "At least, that is what your advertisement claims." Parker Pine met her gaze evenly. "Yes," he replied. Her dark brows arched. "Why? Why do I help people?" he asked, genuinely intrigued. "Because it's what I do. It's my profession." "No," she interrupted, leaning forward, the emerald catching the light again. "Why did you send it to me? Was it some tactic? Your way of drumming up business in foreign lands?" Her voice had turned sharper, almost mocking. But Parker Pine, unflappable as always, smiled gently and shook his head. "No," he said, "I'm on holiday. Business was the last thing on my mind." "Then why?" she pressed. "Because I had reason to believe," he said, his voice quiet but firm, "that you are unhappy." For a brief moment, the imperious Lady Esther Carr seemed to falter. A flicker of something, anger, sadness, or perhaps fear, crossed her face. But she recovered quickly, setting down her coffee cup with deliberate precision. "Unhappy?" she repeated, her tone icy. "What makes you think that?" Parker Pine leaned back slightly, observing her with the practiced eye of a man who had seen every shade of human misery. "It's not so much what I think," he said. "It's what I sense. People who are content don't isolate themselves in houses like this, far from everyone they've ever known. They don't live surrounded by beauty while radiating pain." She laughed then, a sharp, bitter sound. "You presume a great deal, Mr. Parker Pine." "Perhaps," he said, unfazed, "but I'm rarely wrong." Lady Esther's eyes narrowed, her fingers playing absently with the edge of her robe. "You speak of unhappiness as though it's a condition that can be cured." "Some sorrows," she said, her voice dropping to a whisper, "cannot be healed." they are etched into the soul. Parker Pyne leaned forward, his expression softening. Perhaps, he said, but sometimes they can be understood, and in understanding there is relief. She looked away, her gaze fixed on the courtyard's shadowed corners. For the first time, her imperious mask seemed to slip, revealing a glimpse of the woman beneath. When she spoke again, her voice was quieter, almost contemplative. Parker Pyne met her gaze evenly. "Yes," he replied. Her dark brows arched. "Why?" "Why do I help people?" he asked, genuinely intrigued. "Because it's what I do. It's my profession." "No," she interrupted, leaning forward, the emerald catching the light again. "Why did you send it to me? Was it some tactic? Your way of drumming up business in foreign lands?" Her voice had turned sharper, almost mocking. But Parker Pyne, unflappable as always, smiled gently and shook his head. "No," he said, "I'm on holiday. Business was the last thing on my mind." "Then why?" she pressed. "Because I had reason to believe," he said, his voice quiet but firm, "that you are unhappy." For a brief moment, the imperious Lady Esther Carr seemed to falter. A flicker of something, anger, sadness, or perhaps fear, crossed her face. But she recovered quickly, setting down her coffee cup with deliberate precision. "Unhappy?" she repeated, her tone icy. "What makes you think that?" Parker Pyne leaned back slightly, observing her with the practiced eye of a man who had seen every shade of human misery. "It's not so much what I think," he said. "It's what I sense. People who are content don't isolate themselves in houses like this, far from everyone they've ever known. They don't live surrounded by beauty while radiating pain." She laughed then, a sharp, bitter sound. "You presume a great deal, Mr. Parker Pyne." "Perhaps," he said, unfazed, "but I'm rarely wrong." Lady Esther's eyes narrowed, her fingers playing absently with the edge of her robe. "You speak of unhappiness as though it's a condition that can be cured." "Some sorrows," she said, her voice dropping to a whisper, "cannot be healed. They are etched into the soul." Parker Pyne leaned forward, his expression softening. "Perhaps," he said, "but sometimes they can be understood, and in understanding there is relief." She looked away, her gaze fixed on the courtyard's shadowed corners. For the first time, her imperious mask seemed to slip, revealing a glimpse of the woman beneath. When she spoke again, her voice was quieter, almost contemplative. He spoke of society's latest gossip, the fashion houses of Paris, and the small, unassuming shops tucked away in London's alleys, where treasures awaited the sharp-eyed. He talked of restaurants and race meetings, the thrill of the theater, and the scandals that whispered through grand country houses. His words flowed effortlessly, creating a tapestry of life back home. He ended with a homely image of London evenings, the trams and buses, the tired but contented crowds heading home to their modest, warm abodes. As he spoke, Lady Esther's proud posture softened. The haughty tilt of her chin dropped. Her imperious mask began to crack. Silent tears slid down her cheeks. She made no effort to stop them, nor to hide them. When Parker Pyne finally fell silent, she abandoned all pretense. Her shoulders shook as she sobbed openly, a sound raw with the weight of unspoken grief. Parker Pyne remained quiet, his gaze steady and unyielding. His face bore the look of a man who had played his hand perfectly and achieved the desired result. At last, Lady Esther raised her head. Her tear-streaked face was defiant, but her voice was bitter. "Well," she demanded, "are you satisfied now?" "I think so," Parker Pyne replied, his tone soft. "How am I supposed to bear it?" she cried suddenly, her voice breaking. "How shall I bear it, never leaving here, never seeing anyone again?" The words came as though they had been torn from her soul. She flushed, suddenly angry at her own outburst. "Well?" she demanded again, her voice hardening. "Aren't you going to say it? Aren't you going to make the obvious remark? If you want to go home so much, why not do so?" Parker Pyne shook his head. "No," he said quietly. "It's not nearly so simple, not for you." Something in his tone made her freeze. A flicker of fear passed through her eyes. "Do you know why I can't go back?" "I think so," Parker Pyne said evenly. "You're wrong," she snapped. "You couldn't possibly guess." "I don't guess," Parker Pyne said, his voice calm, unshaken. "I observe, and I classify." She shook her head vehemently. "You don't know anything at all. I'll have to convince you." "I see," Parker Pyne said, a trace of amusement in his voice. "When I came here," Lady Esther began, her voice low, "I flew by the new German air service from Baghdad." "Yes," Parker Pyne said, his gaze unwavering. "You were flown by a young pilot, H. Shell, and afterward he came here to see you." "Yes." The word was softer this time, hesitant, almost vulnerable. "And," Parker Pyne continued, "you had a companion. A friend, perhaps." Her voice turned to steel. "My companion. Her name was Muriel King. Did you care for her?" "What do you mean, care for her?" she snapped. Her face twisted, but she caught herself. Her voice shifted colder now. "She was useful to me." "And when she died?" Parker Pyne asked, his voice gentle but probing. Her composure cracked. "Naturally, she began angrily, but then her voice faltered. She clenched her hands, glaring at him. "Really, Mr. Parker Pyne? Is it necessary to drag all of this up?" She was trembling now, her facade of control crumbling. Parker Pyne watched her carefully, his face calm and impassive, as though he already knew the truth she was too terrified to admit. Lady Esther's voice cracked with irritation. "I think I've indulged you enough, Mr. Parker Pyne. If you'll kindly tell me what I owe you—" But Parker Pyne didn't budge. He sat, calm and immovable, showing no signs of offense. Instead, he pressed on, his questions as deliberate as his demeanor. "Since Muriel King died, Herr Schall hasn't been to see you, has he?" Her eyes flashed with a hint of something unspoken. "No," she said curtly. "And if he were to come, would you receive him?" "Certainly not." "You'd refuse him absolutely." "Absolutely," she snapped, her tone frosty. "Herr Schall will not be admitted." Parker Pyne leaned back thoughtfully, as though contemplating a chessboard of possibilities. "Yes," he murmured. "You couldn't very well say anything else." Her composure faltered for a brief moment. She shifted uncomfortably, then said, almost uncertainly, I don't know what you mean." Parker Pyne's gaze didn't waver. "Did you know, Lady Esther, that young Herr Schall was in love with Muriel King?" The color drained from her face. She stiffened, but her voice, now softer, betrayed her. "He was." "Yes," Parker Pyne continued. "He's a sentimental young man. Even now, he treasures her memory." "Does he?" Her voice was barely above a whisper now. "What was she like?" Parker Pyne asked. "What do you mean?" "What was she like?" Her words were clipped, defensive. "How would I know?" "You must have looked at her sometimes," Parker Pyne said mildly. "Oh, that." Her gaze flickered, unfocused. "She was pleasant enough. A nice-looking young woman, I suppose, about my age, just about." There was a pause, and then her voice sharpened again. "Why do you think Herr Schall cared for her?" "Because he told me so," Parker Pyne said simply, in the most unmistakable terms. "He was quite distressed when she died, very distressed." Lady Esther shot to her feet, trembling with anger. "Do you believe I murdered her?" Parker Pine didn't flinch. He wasn't the sort of man to leap to his feet in dramatic response. Instead, he looked up at her with a calm, fatherly expression. "No, my dear child," he said gently. "I don't believe you murdered her. And that being the case, I think the sooner you stop this performance and go home, the better." Her eyes blazed with fury. "Performance? What on earth are you talking about?" Parker Pine folded his hands, his voice steady but piercing. "The truth is, you lost your nerve. Badly. You thought you'd be accused of murdering your employer." Lady Esther froze, her face pale as chalk. Parker Pine pressed on. "You're not Lady Esther Carr. I knew that before I came here. But I've been testing my theory, and now I'm certain." A sly smile crept across his face, benign yet knowing. "When I described London to you earlier, the cinemas, the cheap shops, the garden suburbs, you reacted. Every word struck a chord. But when I mentioned country house gossip, new nightclubs, Mayfair chatter, you were utterly indifferent. None of it meant anything to you." He leaned forward, his voice softening, becoming almost paternal. "Sit down and tell me the truth, Muriel King. You didn't murder Lady Esther, but you believed you might be accused of doing so. Now, let's start from the beginning. Tell me how it all came about." Her shoulders slumped, and the proud facade crumbled at last. She sank onto the divan, covering her face with trembling hands. When she spoke, her words tumbled out in hurried bursts, each sentence a confession. I have to start from the beginning," she stammered. "I was afraid of her. She wasn't mad, not quite, but she was strange, a little unhinged. She brought me out here with her. Like a fool, I thought it was romantic, so exciting. I was just a silly little fool." She took a shaky breath, her hands twisting in her lap. "There was some business with a chauffeur back in England. She was man-mad, you see, obsessed. But he wouldn't have anything to do with her, and it humiliated her. People found out. They laughed at her behind her back. That's why she left. To save face." Muriel's voice dropped, trembling with the weight of her memories. This whole act, solitude in the desert, the grand retreat, she only meant to keep it up for a while. Then she'd go back, reclaim her dignity, but she got worse. She was different out here, wilder. And then there was the pilot. She trailed off, her face stricken. "Hercule," Parker Pine prompted. "Yes." Her voice was barely audible. She fixated on him, and when he came here, he came to see me, not her. She thought. She paused, swallowing hard. Well, you could imagine what she thought. And then Muriel looked down, her voice breaking. She turned on me. She said I'd never leave, that I was her slave. Her slave, she called me. She said she had the power of life and death over me. Parker Pine nodded slowly, seeing the picture come into focus. Lady Esther spiraling into delusion, wielding her imagined power over a young, terrified girl. But one day, Muriel continued, her voice trembling with emotion, something in me snapped. I stood up to her. I told her I was stronger than she was. I said I'd throw her off the edge of the terrace if she didn't leave me alone. Her eyes filled with tears. She was frightened. Really frightened. I'd always been so meek, so quiet. I think she thought I meant it. Muriel's voice cracked as she whispered the final words. She stepped back too far, and then she was gone. She buried her face in her hands, her body racked with sobs. Parker Pine sat silently for a moment, letting the storm of her confession pass. Then he spoke, his voice calm, soothing. You didn't murder her, Muriel. You've been carrying this guilt, this fear, for too long. It's time to let it go. Time to go home. Muriel looked up at him, her tear-streaked face full of disbelief. For the first time, hope flickered in her eyes. Lady Esther's voice trembled with frustration, a crack of irritation seeping through the carefully maintained calm. "I think I've indulged you enough, Mr. Parker Pyne. If you'd kindly tell me what I owe you." Parker Pyne remained still, unfazed, his composed demeanor giving nothing away. He didn't react to her sharp tone. Instead, he pressed on, his questions deliberate, each one falling like a stone into still water, creating ripples of tension. "Since Muriel King's death, Hercule hasn't come to see you, has he?" A flicker of something unspoken, darted through Lady Esther's eyes. "No," she replied, the word clipped, as if she'd already sealed off that chapter of her life. "And if he were to come?" Pyne's voice was like velvet, smooth but cutting. "Would you receive him?" "Certainly not." "You'd refuse him, absolutely?" "Absolutely," Lady Esther snapped, her voice cold and brittle. "Hercule will not be admitted." Pyne leaned back in his chair, his fingers steepled thoughtfully. "Yes," he murmured, almost to himself. You couldn't very well say anything else. A subtle shift in her posture, a slight crack in her icy exterior. I don't know what you mean," she stammered, a rare flicker of uncertainty clouding her composure. Pyne's gaze pierced her, unwavering, relentless. "Did you know, Lady Esther, that young Hercule was in love with Muriel King?" Her face blanched, the blood draining from her cheeks as if he'd struck a blow. Her gaze hardened instantly, but the tremor in her voice betrayed her. "He was?" "Yes," Pyne continued, his voice a soft but unyielding drumbeat. "He's a sentimental young man. Even now, he treasures her memory." "Does he?" Her words were barely a whisper, trembling with a mix of disbelief and something else, perhaps fear. Pyne pressed on, his tone casual, as though speaking of nothing more than the weather. "What was she like?" Lady Esther's eyes narrowed, defensive. "What do you mean, what was she like?" She spat, irritation seeping back into her voice. "How would I know?" "You must have looked at her sometimes," Pyne suggested mildly, not backing down. Lady Esther's eyes flickered briefly, as if her mind had wandered to a memory she didn't wish to revisit. "Oh, that," she muttered dismissively. "She was pleasant enough. A nice-looking young woman, I suppose, just about my age." There was a pause, thick with tension. Then her voice grew sharp again, brittle. "Why do you think Hercule cared for her?" Pyne's voice was a quiet declaration of truth. "Because he told me so, in no uncertain terms. He was distraught when she died, utterly devastated." Lady Esther shot up, her chair scraping violently against the floor. "Do you believe I murdered her?" she demanded, her words like daggers. Pyne didn't flinch. He didn't leap to his feet or react with drama. He simply met her gaze with a calm, fatherly stare. "No, my dear Lady Esther, I don't believe you murdered her," he said, his voice gentle, almost patronizing. "But I do believe you've been performing a little act. And I think it's time to stop." "Performance?" Lady Esther echoed, her voice rising in fury. "What are you talking about?" Pyne's voice remained steady, his gaze cutting through her defenses. "The truth, Lady Esther, is that you've lost your nerve. You were afraid you'd be accused of murdering your employer." The color drained from her face. Her breath caught. Pyne leaned forward, his voice now a soft, almost intimate whisper. "But the thing is, you're not Lady Esther Carr. I knew that the moment I arrived. I've been testing a theory, and now I'm sure." A small, knowing smile tugged at the corners of his lips. When I mentioned London earlier, cinemas, cheap shops, garden suburbs, you reacted. Every word struck a chord. But when I spoke of country house gossip, nightclubs, Mayfair chatter, you couldn't care less. It didn't resonate with you. He leaned in closer, his voice taking on a more paternal tone. Sit down, Muriel King. It's time to tell me the truth. You didn't murder Lady Esther, but you feared being blamed for it. Now, let's start from the beginning. Tell me everything. Her shoulders sagged. The walls she had so carefully built around herself crumbled in an instant. She sank into the divan, trembling, and covered her face with shaking hands. The confession spilled out of her in rushed, broken words. I have to start from the beginning, she whispered. I was afraid of her. She wasn't mad, not really. But she was strange. She brought me here, you see. I thought it was romantic, exciting. I was a fool. Her voice wavered as she spoke. There was this thing with a chauffeur back in England. She was obsessed with him. But he didn't want her. He humiliated her. People found out. They laughed at her behind her back. That's why she left. To save face. Her hands twisted in her lap, her breath coming in shallow bursts. She planned to go back, just for a little while, but she got worse. Out here she changed. She grew wilder. And then there was the pilot. Parker Pine waited for her to gather herself, sensing the storm that was coming. Hercule? He prompted gently. Yes, she whispered, almost inaudible now. She fixated on him, but when he came to see me, not her, she faltered, swallowing hard, her face pale. She thought. Pine's voice was gentle but insistent. What did she think, Muriel? Her voice trembled, breaking with emotion. She turned on me. She said I was her slave, she called me, that she had power over me, life and death. Pine nodded slowly, the pieces falling into place. A young girl, trapped in the grip of a delusional woman, powerless against her twisted sense of authority. But one day, something inside me snapped, Muriel continued, her voice rising in a raw rush of guilt. I stood up to her. I told her I was stronger, that I'd throw her off the terrace if she didn't leave me alone. Tears welled in her eyes as she spoke the next words, almost in a whisper. She was frightened. She thought I meant it. She stepped back, too far. Muriel broke down completely, her sobs racking her body. Pine sat in silence, allowing the weight of her confession to settle in. Finally, when her sobs subsided, he spoke, his voice soft but firm. You didn't murder her, Muriel. It's time to stop carrying this guilt, time to go home. Muriel's tear-streaked face slowly turned up to look at him, disbelief flickering in her eyes. For the first time, there was a glimmer of hope. Thank you so much for tuning in and listening to this intriguing story narrated by Dr. Rami. If you enjoyed the suspense and the twists, make sure to hit that subscribe button so you never miss out on more captivating tales from The Curious Case Channel. And hey, don't forget to leave a comment below. Tell us what you think, or share your theories about the mystery. We love hearing from you. Stay curious. A Hunter's Lodge, a tale of murder and mystery. It's funny how life has a way of pulling you into its most bizarre and chilling games when you least expect it. For Hercule Poirot, even influenza wasn't enough to keep him away from the scent of a mystery, or at least, not entirely. What began as a quiet convalescence for the famous detective soon spiraled into a web of suspense, lies, and murder. And at the center of it all? A small, desolate shooting lodge in the heart of the Derbyshire moors, shrouded by fog and secrets that refused to stay buried. As the clock struck noon, Poirot sat up in bed, surrounded by a fortress of pillows, his impeccable mustache twitching ever so slightly. Even in illness, the great detective maintained his air of precision and poise. "After all," he murmured in his thick Belgian accent, "it is possible that I shall not die this time." His attempt at humor, coming from someone battling influenza, earned him a chuckle from his faithful companion, Captain Hastings. "That's the spirit, Poirot," Hastings replied, sensing a flicker of his friend's usual brilliance returning. The quiet recovery was soon interrupted by a knock at the door, followed by the landlady's hurried voice. "There's a gentleman downstairs," she announced, her tone tinged with urgency. "He insists on seeing Monsieur Poirot, or you, Captain Hastings. Says it's an emergency." When Hastings descended, he was greeted by a man of sharp appearance yet haunted eyes. Roger Havering, a name that would soon be etched in his memory. With an air of desperation, Havering declared, "It's imperative that Monsieur Poirot comes with me to Derbyshire. My uncle, he was murdered last night." The words hung in the air like a storm cloud, their weight undeniable. Murder. The kind of word that sends chills down your spine, that promises a story dripping with suspense and danger. Hastings raced back upstairs, relaying the grave news to Poirot. The detective, though weakened, recognized the opportunity. "Go, Hastings. You know my methods by now. Follow my instructions, report back daily, and together we will uncover the truth." An hour later, Hastings found himself seated opposite Havering on a train bound for the windswept moors of Derbyshire. The rhythmic clatter of the train wheels seemed to echo the questions swirling in his mind. Who was this Uncle Harrington Pace? And why would someone want him dead? What awaited them at the isolated hunter's lodge, and what secrets would they unearth? Havering, his voice strained yet resolute, began to fill in the gaps. Hunter's Lodge is a small shooting box, simple but adequate for a weekend retreat. My uncle has been living with us for the past 3 years, ever since family tensions drove him away from his brother and my elder sibling. A wealthy man, he took a liking to me, perhaps seeing in me the prodigal son he once was. He paused, his gaze distant. "Yesterday, we all traveled to the lodge for a brief respite. I returned to London for urgent matters, leaving my wife and uncle behind. This morning, I received a telegram from my wife. It was brief, chilling. 'Come at once. Uncle Harrington murdered last night.'" Hastings studied the man carefully. There was something about his tone, a mixture of shock, sorrow, and something more elusive, as if he was holding back. The detective in him itched to ask more, but he held back. There would be time. As the train raced through the English countryside, a foreboding sense of unease settled over Hastings. The murder of Harrington Pace was just the beginning. What lay ahead was a mystery that would test his wits, his courage, and his ability to step into Poirot's formidable shoes. Little did I know, Hastings would later reflect, that Hunter's Lodge was a place where secrets roamed freely, and every shadow held a story waiting to be told. And on that cold, gray morning, I was hurtling straight into the heart of it. It was nearing 3 o'clock when we arrived at the small, desolate station of Elmer's Dale. The cold, biting wind seemed to whisper secrets of the moors as we stepped off the train. A solitary carriage awaited us, its driver wrapped in layers to shield himself from the unrelenting chill. The landscape beyond was barren and rugged, an expanse of wild heather and jagged rocks stretching as far as the eye could see. The 5-mile drive was eerily silent, save for the rhythmic crunch of the carriage wheels against the gravel. As we approached, a small gray stone house emerged from the mist like a ghostly sentinel. It stood lonely and brooding, nestled in the heart of the moors, with an air that could only be described as foreboding. "A lonely place," I muttered, breaking the silence. Havering nodded, his gaze fixed on the house. "I'll sell it as soon as I can," he said grimly. "I could never live here again." We unlatched the iron gate, its rusty hinges protesting with a loud creak. The narrow path leading to the oak door felt heavier with every step, as if the house itself were burdened with a dark secret it could not bear to hold any longer. Just as my hand reached for the knocker, the door swung open, and a familiar figure stepped out. "Jap!" I exclaimed, startled but not entirely surprised. The Scotland Yard inspector grinned, his sharp eyes twinkling despite the grim circumstances. "Hastings, fancy seeing you here." He turned to Havering. "Mr. Havering, I presume?" "Scotland Yard sent me down this morning to oversee the case. I'll need a quick word with you, sir, before I head back to the village. Won't keep you long." "My wife?" Havering began, his voice tinged with concern. "I've spoken to her, sir, as well as the housekeeper. I've got all I need for now." Jap's tone was brisk but not unkind. "Hastings here can go on to the house. I'll catch up with you shortly." I nodded and made my way to the door. As I rang the bell, I felt an unsettling chill. Not from the weather, but from the weight of what lay within. The door opened after a few moments to reveal a middle-aged woman dressed in somber black. Her face was pale and drawn, her hands trembling slightly as she clasped them before her. "Mr. Havering will be along shortly," I said, stepping inside. "I've come with him from London to assist with the case. Could you briefly tell me what happened here last night?" The woman hesitated, then closed the door behind me, leading me into a dimly lit hall. The faint scent of gun oil lingered in the air, mingling with the earthy smell of the moors. "It was after dinner, sir," she began, her voice low but steady. "A man arrived, asking to see Mr. Pace. He didn't give his name, which struck me as odd, but he spoke like an American, so I assumed he was a friend of Mr. Pace's from his time in the States. I showed him into the gun room and went to fetch Mr. Pace." She paused, her brow furrowing as she recalled the details. "Mr. Pace seemed puzzled when I told him, but he said to the mistress, 'Excuse me, Zoe, while I see what this fellow wants.' He went off to the gun room, and I returned to the kitchen. Not long after, I heard raised voices. It sounded like they were arguing. Then," her voice faltered, and she clasped her hands tighter. "Then I heard a shot." I leaned forward. "What did you do next?" "The mistress and I ran to the gun room, but the door was locked. We had to go around to the window. It was open, and inside—" She shuddered. "Inside was Mr. Pace, shot and bleeding on the floor. And the man. He must have fled through the window before we arrived," she said, shaking her head. "We saw no sign of him. Mrs. Havering sent me to fetch the police. It's a 5-mile walk to the station, but I didn't stop until I got there. The constable came back with me and stayed through the night. This morning, the inspector from London arrived." "What did the man look like?" I asked. She frowned, as if struggling to remember. "He had a black beard and was wearing a light overcoat. He was about middle-aged, I'd say, and spoke with an American accent. That's all I noticed, sir." I nodded, absorbing her account. "Can I speak with Mrs. Havering?" "She's upstairs, sir. I'll let her know you're here." As the housekeeper disappeared up the staircase, I took in my surroundings. The house felt oppressive, its gray stone wall seeming to close in around me. The dim light from the small windows did little to dispel the gloom, and the silence was heavy, broken only by the faint creak of the floorboards above. Moments later, I heard a light, hurried step descending the stairs. I turned to see a strikingly beautiful young woman approaching me. Her flame-colored jumper clung to her slender, almost boyish figure, and her dark eyes sparkled with a mixture of determination and despair. "Mrs. Havering, I presume?" I said, stepping forward. She nodded, her lips pressed into a thin line. "You've come with my husband, she. The first thing that struck me about Mrs. Havering was her vitality. Even amidst the shadow of tragedy, she carried herself with a composure and energy that seemed almost unnatural in such grim circumstances. Her flame-colored jumper and matching leather hat framed her dark, expressive eyes, which sparkled with a mix of curiosity and defiance. When I introduced myself, her lips curved into a faint smile, and she nodded quickly. "Of course, I've heard of you and Monsieur Poirot," she said. "You've done some remarkable work together, haven't you? It was very clever of my husband to bring you here so promptly. Now," she added with an air of brisk efficiency, "how do we begin? I assume you'll have questions, and that's the easiest way to get to the heart of this dreadful matter, isn't it?" Her confidence and clarity were striking, and I wasted no time. "Thank you, Mrs. Havering. Let's start with last night. At what time did this man arrive?" She tilted her head, her brow furrowed slightly as she recalled the details. "It must have been just before 9 o'clock. We had finished dinner and were sitting over our coffee and cigarettes. My husband had already left for London by then. He caught the 6:15 train. How did he get to the station? Was it by car? Our own car isn't here. One came out from the garage in Elmersdale to take him in time for the train." I nodded, noting this detail. "And your uncle, was he acting normally before the visitor arrived?" She gave me a puzzled look. "Absolutely. He was his usual self, calm, composed, and perfectly normal." "And this visitor? Did you see him?" Mrs. Havering shook her head. "No, I'm afraid not. Mrs. Middleton, our housekeeper, showed him directly into the gun room and then informed my uncle. I only heard about him when my uncle excused himself, saying, 'Excuse me, Zoe, while I see what this fellow wants.' He seemed slightly annoyed, but went to meet him immediately. And then?" She drew a sharp breath, her hands clenching the armrest of her chair. "It was only about 5 minutes later that I heard raised voices. They were arguing, though I couldn't make out what was being said. I rushed out into the hall and almost collided with Mrs. Middleton. Then, suddenly, there was a gunshot." Her voice faltered, but she regained her composure quickly. "The gunroom door was locked from the inside, so we had to go around the house to the window. That took some time, and by then the murderer had escaped." She paused, her eyes darkening. "My poor uncle. He had been shot through the head. I saw immediately that he was dead. I didn't touch anything and sent Mrs. Middleton to fetch the police." Her meticulous account impressed me, but I wasn't done yet. "The weapon, can you tell me anything about it?" She nodded. "A pair of revolvers belonging to my husband were mounted on the wall in the gun room. One of them is missing. I pointed this out to the police, and they've taken the other one for examination. I assume they'll match the bullet to confirm it's the same type." "May I see the gun room?" "Of course," she replied. "The police have already finished their work there, but the body has been removed." She rose gracefully and led me to the scene of the crime. As we entered the room, Havering returned to the hall. Mrs. Havering excused herself and rushed to meet him, leaving me alone to examine the scene. The gun room was a simple masculine space, dominated by dark wooden furniture and hunting trophies. A faint metallic smell of blood lingered in the air, mingling with the scent of gunpowder. The most notable feature was a large, dark stain on the carpet, marking where Harrington Pace had fallen. I examined the room with painstaking care, but to my disappointment there were no obvious clues, no scraps of paper, no misplaced objects, nothing to give me an immediate lead. I snapped a few photographs with my small camera, determined to document every detail, no matter how insignificant it seemed. The window, through which the murderer had presumably fled, was slightly ajar. The ground outside was heavily trampled, making it impossible to discern any clear footprints. Frustrated but not deterred, I resolved to continue my investigation elsewhere. Leaving Hunter's Lodge behind, I made my way back to Elmer's Dale and met Jap at the Matlock Arms. The Scotland Yard inspector was as brisk and unflappable as ever, but his expression grew grim as he led me to view the body. Harrington Pace was a small, spare man, clean-shaven, with sharp features that were unmistakably American. He had been shot through the back of the head at close range. "Turned away for a moment," Jap remarked, "and the other fellow snatched up a revolver and shot him. The revolver Mrs. Havering handed over was fully loaded, so I'd wager the missing one was as well. Blasted foolishness, keeping loaded guns hanging on the wall like ornaments." "What's your impression of the case so far?" I asked as Inspector Jap leaned back in his chair, his sharp eyes twinkling with a mixture of amusement and certainty. "You know," he began, "for a moment there, I really had my eye on Mr. Havering. It's always the money, isn't it? The uncle's will. Well, you can bet your boots that it'd be in his favor. And considering Havering's debts, this would be a pretty convenient way to solve them." I raised an eyebrow, intrigued by Jap's line of thought. "So, why didn't you pursue him further?" Jap chuckled. "Oh, I wanted to catch him before he saw his wife, but it turns out their statements match up perfectly. And here's the clincher. Havering's alibi checks out. I've been to the station, no doubt about it. He left on the 6:15 train and got to London by 10:30. Went straight to his club. If that's confirmed, and it seems it will be, then there's no way he could have been back here at 9 o'clock, wearing a black beard, shooting his uncle in cold blood. The image of Havering in a false beard struck me as absurd, but I couldn't help asking, 'And what do you think of that beard, Jap?' A mischievous grin spread across Jap's face. 'Ah, the beard,' he said with a wink. 'Funny thing that, it must have grown mighty fast, right in the 5 miles between Elmer's Dale and Hunter's Lodge. Americans I've met are usually clean-shaven, you know. Suspicious, if you ask me.' Jap paused, his tone turning more serious. I questioned the housekeeper first, then Mrs. Havering. Their stories line up well enough. Still, it's a shame Mrs. Havering didn't see the man herself. She's a sharp one, that lady. Could have noticed something useful, something to put us on the right track." I nodded, but my mind was already racing. The details weren't adding up. The mysterious black-bearded man, the locked door, the missing revolver, and the meticulous Mrs. Havering. It all felt too neat, too perfect. That evening, I sat down to compose a detailed account for Poirot. It was my usual style, meticulous, methodical, and thorough. I included everything Jap had shared, along with a few developments that had surfaced since our last conversation. The first breakthrough came when the bullet was extracted from Harrington Pace's body. It matched the caliber of the revolver Mrs. Havering had handed to the police, identical in every way to the one missing from the gun room. That alone was no surprise. But the second development was far more intriguing. Havering's alibi, scrutinized from every angle, was airtight. He had indeed arrived in London on the 6:15 train. Multiple witnesses, including the station staff and members of his club, confirmed his presence in the city well before the murder took place. That put him miles away from Hunter's Lodge at the time of the crime. And then there was the most sensational twist of all. Early that morning, a city gentleman on his way to the district railway station in Ealing stumbled upon a curious sight. A brown paper parcel wedged between the railings of Haven Green. Intrigued, he opened it, only to find a revolver inside. The discovery caused an immediate stir, and by nightfall it was confirmed. This was the very revolver we had been searching for. The missing gun from Hunter's Lodge. Only one bullet had been fired from it, completing the picture of the crime. I added all of this to my report, feeling a flicker of triumph. Surely Poirot would be impressed with the thoroughness of my work, but Poirot, as ever, was a step ahead. The following morning, as I sat enjoying a modest breakfast, a telegram arrived. It was brief, pointed, and, typical of my little friend, tinged with exasperation. Of course, Black-Bearded Man was not Havering. Only you or Jap would have such an idea. Wire me description of housekeeper and what clothes she wore this morning. Same of Mrs. Havering. Do not waste time taking photographs of interiors. They are underexposed and not in the least artistic. I couldn't help but scowl at his unnecessary sarcasm. Underexposed and not artistic? Really? Poirot's tone may have been facetious, but his instincts were always sharp. The request for descriptions of the housekeeper and Mrs. Havering was odd, to say the least. Why focus on them when the revolver and Havering's alibi seemed to be the pivotal points? Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that Poirot was onto something. There was a thread here, a thin, almost invisible thread, that he had spotted, while I was still fumbling through the fabric of the case. The black-bearded man might not have been Havering, but who was he? And why had no one seen him clearly? Something about this case was off, and as I prepared to wire the descriptions Poirot had requested, I realized the full scope of the puzzle was still hidden in the shadows. The game was far from over. I'll admit it, Poirot's telegram left me dumbfounded. His suggestion that I describe the clothing worn by the two women struck me as not just peculiar, but outright absurd. What possible relevance could such trivial details hold in a case so deeply tangled in murder? Yet Poirot was Poirot, and I had long learned not to underestimate his methods, no matter how eccentric they seemed. Grudgingly, I did my best to comply, though I, a mere man, could hardly be expected to describe women's attire with any degree of accuracy. To my eyes, clothes were just clothes. Nevertheless, I jotted down everything I could recall. Mrs. Havering's flame-colored jumper, the housekeeper's plain black dress. It felt like a futile exercise, but I knew better than to question Poirot's eccentricities. At 11, a reply wire arrived, terse yet electrifying in its implications. Advise Jap arrest housekeeper before it is too late. I stared at the telegram, rereading it twice to make sure I hadn't misunderstood. Arrest the housekeeper? Mrs. Middleton, the quiet, unassuming woman who had blended so seamlessly into the background of this grim affair. The very idea seemed preposterous. Still, Poirot's instincts were rarely wrong, and I immediately took the wire to Jap. The inspector's reaction was as sharp as I'd expected. "He's the goods, that Monsieur Poirot," Jap muttered, swearing softly under his breath. "If he says so, there's something in it, and I hardly notice the woman. Just goes to show, eh?" Still, he hesitated, rubbing his chin thoughtfully. "I don't know if I can go so far as to arrest her, but I'll have her watched. Let's head up and take another look at her." Unfortunately, Poirot's timing, as brilliant as it often was, had been just a fraction too late. By the time we reached Hunter's Lodge, Mrs. Middleton was gone, vanished into thin air like a wisp of smoke on the moors. Her belongings left behind in her room offered no clues. A box of ordinary clothes, utterly mundane in every way, provided no insight into her identity or whereabouts. It was as if the woman had never existed. The disappearance threw an entirely new shadow over the case, and we turned to Mrs. Havering for answers. Her account, though straightforward, only deepened the mystery. "I engaged her about 3 weeks ago," Mrs. Havering explained, her tone tinged with disbelief. "Mrs. Emery, our previous housekeeper, had left, and I contacted Selburn's agency in Mount Street. It's a very well-known agency. I've always found my staff through them. They sent several women for me to interview, but Mrs. Middleton seemed the most suitable. She was polite, quiet, and had excellent references. I hired her on the spot and notified the agency immediately." She paused, shaking her head. "I can't believe there was anything suspicious about her. She was such a nice, respectable woman." "Yet she bolted," Jap said dryly. "Respectable women don't vanish into the night unless they've got something to hide." The implications were chilling. While Mrs. Middleton couldn't have physically committed the crime, both Mrs. Havering and the housekeeper had been in the hall when the shot was fired. Her abrupt flight suggested a connection to the murder. But what could that connection be? I wired the latest developments to Poirot, including Mrs. Middleton's disappearance and Mrs. Havering's account. My own instincts told me to return to London and investigate Selborne's agency. Surely they could shed light on the mysterious housekeeper's identity. Poirot's response came swiftly, and as always it left me feeling both impressed and confounded. Useless to inquire at agency. They will never have heard of her. Find out what vehicle took her up to Hunter's Lodge when she first arrived there. The cryptic message raised more questions than it answered, but I knew better than to argue. Poirot's requests always led somewhere, even if I couldn't see the path. Elmer's Dale wasn't exactly bustling with transportation options. The local garage had only 2 cars, and there were 2 station flies available. Yet none of these had been requisitioned on the date Mrs. Middleton first arrived. Determined to leave no stone unturned, I took it upon myself to make inquiries at Selborne's agency in London. The result? Exactly as Poirot had predicted. The agency had no record of a Mrs. Middleton ever being on their books. They had indeed sent several candidates to Mrs. Havering, but none matched the housekeeper's description. When Mrs. Havering sent her engagement fee to the agency, she had neglected to mention which candidate she had selected. The agency, believing the matter settled, had not pursued further details. The facts were damning. Mrs. Middleton hadn't been hired through Selborne's agency at all. Her references were likely fabricated, her identity a carefully constructed lie. She had insinuated herself into Hunter's Lodge with a precision and subtlety that spoke of careful planning. And then, when the murder occurred, she had vanished just as smoothly. The pieces of the puzzle were falling into place, but the picture they formed was still obscured. Who was Mrs. Middleton? How had she known to insert herself into the Haverings' lives at just the right moment? And most importantly, what was she hiding? As I pondered these questions, I couldn't help but feel a grudging admiration for Poirot. Even from a distance, his sharp mind was peeling back the layers of this case with a surgical precision. And though I didn't yet understand where this trail would lead, I knew one thing for certain. Mrs. Middleton was the key. Hunter's Lodge, with its desolate moors and dark secrets, was far from finished with us. When I returned to London, I found Poirot comfortably ensconced in his armchair by the fire, a steaming cup of chocolate in hand. The sight of him, so serene and composed, was a stark contrast to my own frustrated state. "Mon ami Hastings," he exclaimed, his eyes lighting up as he saw me. "How glad I am to see you. Truly, I have a great affection for you, you know. Tell me, did you enjoy yourself? Running to and fro with the good Jap, asking questions, investigating, unraveling mysteries to your heart's content?" "Poirot," I groaned, dropping into the chair opposite him. "The whole thing is an impenetrable fog, a dark mystery. It will never be solved." Poirot chuckled softly, his mustache twitching with amusement. "Ah, my dear Hastings, it is true, we may not cover ourselves with glory this time. But do not despair. After all, cracking a nut is no challenge for me. I am a veritable squirrel." I stared at him, bewildered. "Poirot, this is no time for jokes. This case is impossible. A hard nut, as you say, but one beyond even your cracking." "Non, non, mon ami," Poirot replied, his tone suddenly serious. He leaned forward, his sharp eyes gleaming. "It is not the cracking of the nut that embarrasses me. I already know who killed Mr. Harrington Pace." "You what?" I cried, sitting bolt upright. "How did you figure it out?" Poirot waved a hand dismissively. "Your answers to my telegram supplied me with all I needed to know. Let us now, my dear Hastings, examine the facts methodically and in order, as is the way of Hercule Poirot." He began ticking off points on his fingers. "First, Mr. Harrington Pace was a man of considerable fortune, which, at his death, would pass to his nephew. That is point 1. Second, this nephew, Roger Havering, is a man desperately in need of money. That is point 2. Third, this same nephew has a reputation, how shall we put it, of loose moral fiber. That is point 3. I interrupted, shaking my head. But Roger Havering was proven to be in London when the murder occurred. Précisément, Poirot agreed. He could not have been the one to shoot his uncle. The timings make it impossible. And yet, Hastings, we forget something important. There is also a Mrs. Havering in this story." "But she was with the housekeeper at the time of the murder," I protested. "Ah, yes," Poirot said, his voice softening. "The housekeeper, or rather, the housekeeper who disappeared. Tell me, Hastings, do you not find her peculiar? A woman so quiet, so respectable, and yet she vanishes as if the earth had swallowed her whole." I frowned. She was playing her part, I suppose. Maybe she admitted her confederate, the black-bearded man? Poirot shook his head with a sly smile. "No, mon ami. Her part was far more ingenious. Her role was to provide an alibi for Mrs. Havering. And that, my friend, is why no one will ever find her, because she does not exist." I gaped at him, stunned. "What? No such person? What do you mean?" Poirot's voice grew animated, his hands gesturing as he explained. "Zoe Havering, my dear Hastings, was an actress before her marriage. A talented one, I might add. Think, Hastings. You and Jap saw the housekeeper only in a dimly lit hall, a middle-aged figure dressed in black, speaking in a faint, subdued voice. But tell me this. Did you ever see Mrs. Middleton and Mrs. Havering together at the same time?" I opened my mouth to reply, but closed it again. The truth was clear. No, we had not. Poirot continued, his voice triumphant. It was child's play for a clever and daring woman like Zoe Havering. On the pretext of summoning her mistress, she would slip upstairs, exchange her black dress for a bright jumper and a hat with black curls attached, remove her makeup with a few deft touches, apply a hint of rouge. And voila. The subdued housekeeper transforms into the brilliant, vivacious Zoe Havering. "But the revolver," I exclaimed. "The one found at Ealing. It couldn't have been Mrs. Havering who placed it there." "No," Poirot agreed. "That was Roger Havering's task, and it was their one mistake. A man who commits murder with a revolver found on the spot does not carry it all the way to London. No, Hastings, their plan was simple: to divert the attention of the police, to shift the focus far from Hunter's Lodge. Roger Havering discharged one shot from the revolver, carried it to Ealing, placed it in the parcel, and returned to his club to reinforce his alibi. Meanwhile, Zoe Havering quietly shot her uncle after dinner, reloaded the revolver, replaced it on the wall, and began her charade as the grieving niece. I sat back, stunned. "It's incredible," I murmured, "almost unbelievable, and yet it is true," Poirot said with a nod. "But alas, mon ami, to bring them to justice will not be easy. Jap may try, but I fear we must leave them to fate. Or, as you say, le bon Dieu." He sighed, his expression softening. "The wicked flourish, yes, Hastings, but always at a price." Poirot's words proved prophetic. Though Jap was convinced of the truth, he could not gather sufficient evidence to secure a conviction. Harrington Pace's fortune passed into the hands of his murderers. But justice, as Poirot had promised, was not done with them. Months later, I read in the papers that the Honorable Roger Havering and Mrs. Zoe Havering were among those killed in the tragic crash of the air mail to Paris. The news was brief, but to me, it carried a profound weight. Justice, in its own relentless way, had been satisfied.